Good morning, and thank you for joining me for Eye on New Mexico. And in the seat next to me today, we have Congresswoman Lujan Grisham, representing, of course, New Mexico's 1st District. Thank you for being here today.
Nicole, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, you have a couple weeks left until the August recess, so a lot for Congress to accomplish in that time. And we're going to be talking about some of the major issues we've been covering here in the news, of course. We'll have her on for the full half hour today talking about immigration, the VA hospital and the concerns there, some recent Supreme Court issues that have come up, and a foreclosure workshop that New Mexicans may want to get involved in coming up on July 26th. So some help for New Mexicans while the Congresswoman is here in New Mexico. So let's start by talking about this immigration issue.
Absolutely.
Artesia, New Mexico is not in your district, but you have traveled there recently to talk to officials about what's happening at the FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down there, now being used as a holding facility for immigrants. This past week we saw some immigrants already sent back to their home countries. What's happening down there? What are you observing? And then we'll get into some of the specifics on your reaction to what's going on with this bigger issue.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I wanted to travel there in person and meet these children and their mothers. You want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to provide the right kind of humanitarian support, that it's a safe and appropriate facility. We're dealing with people's lives, and they've had an incredibly arduous, horrific journey here, and it was important to me to make sure that we're doing everything in our power, and in fact, if there's a gap, that maybe that Congress does something about that. The second and third issues is I want to make sure that that border officials and immigration and homeland security all have the tools, the resources they currently need to meet the needs of these women and children. And then the third thing is I'm concerned about the due process rights. When there are very specific laws that we must follow, that we require other countries to follow. And I'm not convinced, based on my visit, that we're quite there yet. The bricks and mortar definitely done, and I want to applaud the men and women in Homeland Security and Border Patrol who've really done everything they can to create an environment to provide shelter and food and health care, medical services to these children and their mothers.
You bring out medical services, and I wanted to get to something that's very concerning that you've been talking about a lot, which is that some of the younger children, the female children there, are being given pregnancy tests. And I call them children. I mean, these are teenagers, young as 11 years old, being given pregnancy tests, and some of these coming back showing that these children are pregnant.
That's right.
Indicating that they have assaulted.
That's exactly what it indicates. So we've been hearing these stories about the likelihood that these young women and their mothers are being sexually abused, assaulted, and raped on these journeys by, I mean, the folks who are smuggling them are unscrupulous. They're in constant danger on the way up. They're engaging all kinds of folks on these trains. It is really an unsafe journey, and that this journey takes 7 to 10 days. And the fact that they are now routinely 11 and up doing urine samples and testing for pregnancy is an indication that these are not wild rumors, that in fact they know unequivocally that that's occurring. It's tragic. What I learned that was even more tragic is that 11 isn't the youngest age that they're concerned about.
Wow.
They're going to start doing these pregnancy tests as early as 9. And that is, among so many other issues, very troubling about what's going on. And in fact, that kind of sexual assault, those human trafficking and domestic violence issues do warrant refugee status under our current law. And if that's the case, then how come so many folks are leaving so immediately from Artesia? So that bears more looking into, certainly from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people don't have a grasp on what exactly qualifies. So I know I don't know exactly what would qualify someone to have refugee status here in this country.
Human trafficking, significant violence, fear, persecution, you know, those are the basic tenets that qualify you for refugee status. And while we're hearing that the majority of these families are coming here for economic reasons, and we've had one member of Congress in the delegation who was actually in Honduras who said exactly that, I'm seeing and hearing the opposite side. So I think the issue here is everybody that comes here seeking permanent residents. Are they going to be eligible? They are not. And should they be eligible? Under the current law, they should not. But what speaks to a bigger question and a bigger statement, which is we need comprehensive immigration reform. Does it resolve what's going on in Latin America and Central America? It doesn't by itself, but it's a clear message that we have policies about immigration into the United States. And because we don't, there has been a flood of misinformation to these countries that, in fact, if you get here, you can stay. And the truth is, for several years, by and large, that's been true because we are not equipped to handle children coming across the border.
Yeah, unaccompanied minors in many cases.
Unaccompanied minors. So when they're taken into custody before today, let's just say, for the past several years, if they can identify other family, they're released
to that family.
That's right. And so it's just that it has been exponentially growing, which again is partially because we aren't doing anything here that's credible, consistent, that's the right messaging, and it has prevented us from acting appropriately so that we've got a foreign policy position in Central America, which we currently don't.
Great points, and clearly this is not going to be solved in the next few weeks before you go on your August recess here. The problems will continue. We will continue to see people, as we just saw this past week, sent out of Roswell, New Mexico, back to their home countries. So, you know, what would you like to see done most immediately?
Well, we have two things that are occurring in Washington right now. So you've got a couple different proposals that say what we should do is we should be stripping those due process requirements. Then we don't have to invest in having immigration lawyers and child welfare advocates and meeting any of those tests. So we should strip that out of the law, and we should spend about $2 billion, half of what the president's proposing, and deal with this crisis. That will build more detention facilities, and that will pay for the transportation back to their home countries. That's what we're seeing. I'm not in favor of that. The president's proposal is $4 billion, but does not strip any of those due process requirements. I think it sends the wrong message across the world. What do we say to Jordan? Well, what you ought to do is strip any of those protections and just get planes and buses. That's what we're doing, and then ship the 3 million refugees you have from Syria and Libya back to their countries. It doesn't solve our world crisis rate. So I don't think we should be stripping those protections. I think we should be meeting those, and we should know unequivocally what's going on with these children and what's going on in these countries. $4 billion, I want to scrutinize that, because what I know so far after a meeting with the White House is that there's not enough of those investments that are going directly to that due process advocacy and making sure we meet the legal standards. It's more about more bricks and mortar and more homeland security and more border patrol. And, you know, we've spent a ton of money in border security, and I think that a lot of that has been valid. But in the El Paso sector, which New Mexico is in, Artesia's in, and El Paso, there are a lot of extra border agents and personnel, including Homeland Security, that can be provided for in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas and in California, so that you're leveraging that personnel. So I want to scrutinize that request a bit more, and I'd like it to be tighter, and I would like it to be dedicated to the places it ought to go. I'd like them to require that we have pediatricians as part of this health care package. They're screening for infectious disease. We know we're doing the pregnancy tests. They're dealing with dehydration, but I think that they ought to do a little bit better job, and it's not to criticize them, but to make sure that they have the tools to get those resources up and running immediately. And I'm not really in favor of a congressional action that would strip any due process requirements. But that's what's going on. One third thing that I think is worth mentioning that's a problem-solving component in the Senate measure that's making its way, and this is we ought to be proactive. If you qualify for a refugee status here, then why aren't we doing those visas like we do, say, in the Congo? So in other places in the world, we provide many more refugee visas into the United States for protection than we do at the Mexican border, or we do for any of the Central American countries. It's a question I have about why we aren't aren't doing that in the first place. And now one of these measures that Congress is anticipating does exactly that. And I think that that's a good idea.
Let's talk about a little bit of the public perception here of what's going on, too, because we've seen in Southern California real massive demonstrations against buses of immigrants coming in. In Artesia here in New Mexico, we did certainly see a heated town hall meeting where people were very concerned about housing immigrants here and very concerned about just nothing being done at the congressional level about immigration reform. So what do you say to these people who are saying, you know, we don't want immigrants to be able to come here with no real set guidelines for how long we're going to keep them here, how much we're going to pay to keep them here, because there are still some unknowns.
I mean, protecting the border and doing all of that effort, I certainly, in my conversations with my constituents, we have a very earnest dialogue. We're spending money. We're about to spend somewhere between $2 and $4 billion to start to just deal with the children. We're spending money. The question is, are we spending money wisely and for the right things, and are we doing the right job protecting the children that are here? I think the hostility in this country, part of that responsibility is in Washington for failing to get comprehensive immigration reform passed, because we don't know what the rules are, and I think the sense is we're providing a standard for folks. We're breaking the law into the country, that many people here aren't getting those same protections and don't get that same advocacy, and there's a sense that they don't get that same investment by their members of Congress. The longer we wait to grow the economy, to take responsible action on immigration reform, we continue to send mixed messages. I do have, I really am very concerned that that hostility in this country was taken out on children. And look at the mistakes we make when we have a candidate running, I think, for Congress in Arizona, who just goes, so it goes after a bus of children, American
YMCA
children. YMCA bus. So this is what happens. We overreact. We react out of fear. We don't have the facts. These children are not criminals in the sense of drug smugglers. Their mothers brought them because, and we met with some nuns from Sisters of Charity in Congress, and the stories that they're telling us, more than the trip here, about what happens to these families and the elevation of hostility, particularly in Honduras, that if you say no to a gang request or violent activity, your whole family is murdered and made an example of. Those bodies are mutilated and put out in those neighborhoods as a message to everybody else. Now, what mother wouldn't try to get her children out?
I can't even imagine being that mother, and I think most people are fairly horrified by hearing this, but of course these horrifying things happen all over the world, and we can't solve all these problems for everyone, is I assume the reaction for a lot of these people.
It is, which is why, and it's a really great place to get right back. We don't have an open border there. No one is, that I am aware of in Congress, is suggesting that that's how we move, or that we send a message that says for all of these Central American countries we have an amnesty environment in the United States, and we're going to help you get. I have not heard a single person in the United States advocate that position. I would never advocate that position. But if we have comprehensive immigration reform, when we have immigration comprehensive, responsible reform, we know how to be proactive in those countries. We know how to respond to those countries. We can help those countries deal with their own crime so that they're doing something about it. They don't want to lose these generations of children and families, and that we can put our resources in places that make a difference for our constituents right here. Those are the kinds of balances that I think people are really hungry for in Congress, and me too. And of course the Senate passed a bill. It's the House, and it's the Republican majority that has refused to allow us to even vote on immigration reform.
Well, hopefully if there's any silver lining to this issue being in the news and the changing conversation here, is that it will motivate something when you guys do get back to work.
I will tell you, I was motivated the second I got there. and I am certainly there again. And in addition to Artesia, we visited the border, and I met with many of the nonprofit and faith-based communities. I think every member of Congress should be spending the time on the ground, being clear and learning about these issues so that they can weigh in productively and move these agendas forward in a meaningful way.
It would be great to see the non-border state lawmakers down here at the border.
And I want to applaud everyone, including the media, for really providing good information and creating an environment for the community of Artesia to answer their questions and to reduce those fears. I think everyone, quite frankly, did a really good job. And I want to applaud even the local officials. They really did a nice job there.
Yeah, good, very good. I heard the mayor there being very responsive and talking to a lot of media outlets. And yeah, it sounded like they actually handled it in a way that didn't get us on the news like we saw in Murrieta, California,
Arizona. So, this is, I always want to be in a position, we all do, to be proud of New Mexico and New Mexicans.
Handling of the
and good for us.
Very good, even with the different opinions. Well, we have a lot more to talk about, actually, besides immigration this morning, but we're going to take a quick break and stay with us. We'll talk more with Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham when we come back.
What do you get when you cross a chiropractor with a nurse practitioner? Effective treatment. Dr. Cecil at the Albuquerque Neck and Back Pain Center is both a chiropractic orthopedist with 25 years experience and a certified nurse practitioner. His office offers dry hydro massage, sine wave current, on-site x-rays, physical therapy, muscle injections, and 4 licensed massage therapists. Conveniently located at Indian School and University. Albuquerque Neck and Back Pain Center.
Thanks for staying with us this morning. Once again, we are talking to Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham. And moving right on, because we don't have a lot of time left with you here this morning, we want to talk a little bit about the VA hospital problems throughout the nation, including at the hospital right here in Albuquerque. You met this week with Sloan Gibson, the acting director of the VA healthcare, or the VA, and let's talk a little bit about what you guys talked about. I know that our 2 senators recently called for him to immediately appoint a director at Albuquerque's hospital, which has been operating essentially, you said, for about the past year without someone in that position. Is that right?
It is, and I think that that's a really important aspect. I mean, we want to know who that local leadership is. That way we can have a direct line of accountability for the changes that the entire delegation is calling for. And I might add, it's not just the New Mexico delegation, although they wrote the letter about the hiring. You know, you've got the Colorado delegation that's affected by what happens in this particular hospital. So you've got a lot of members of Congress that are paying very close attention and want better accountability and better treatment of the veterans. Love that the acting secretary came here. Now, his #1 focus was to reevaluate and make sure that what happened to the veteran who collapsed recently and died, that when they called 911 and didn't do a crash cart there at the VA, that there wasn't anything that the VA should have done differently. And while 3 things: applaud that he was here in person. I think that's really important, and it's a powerful statement about making sure that whatever happens, that they're going to give us the truth and it's going to be credible. 2, that they're reevaluating and really taking a careful look. I really appreciate. But the 3rd thing is, you know, even if this protocol is fine and that they don't see anything that could have been done differently, why don't you have a parallel protocol where you can do more of that emergency responding right on your campus? Big hospitals do it all over the country, so we really challenged them. I certainly did. I want to know what private hospitals with big campuses do. I think you ought to have a dual protocol, and it seems to me that the faster you get medication in for a situation like this, the better the potential for a better outcome. Not that it would have changed the outcome here, but the next patient deserves that protocol exists. So they're going to look at that, get immediately back. They also apologize to the delegation for requiring that we have to do a federal freedom of information request to get any information, and said that will immediately cease, and any information we want about what's going on in that VA is now immediately available. And that is critical, because they have been stalling getting us information so that we can represent our constituents effectively to improve.
You weren't too happy, essentially, with some of the the larger VA system's handling of a lot of this up until this point, especially.
I'm not happy still. I'm not happy still.
Because you were telling me there are some changes that should and could be made immediately that would fix some of these problems. You know, the scheduling, the treatment issues.
Yeah, they need to access private health care resources immediately. And in fact, credit of our private practice folks here in this community, everyone has stepped up and wants to help. Now, you need the VA to pay for those services. The VA can, in fact, and has a program to do that. Before the crisis that we've identified, New Mexico as a region uses that far less than any other hospital. Now, why is that, given that we've got veterans still waiting for a year? I have constituents that have come to me before, during, and since that town hall that are still waiting for those important appointments, and they don't have access to oncologists, and they don't have access to audiologists, and they don't have access to cardiologists. And so I really pushed hard and said that my expectation of the acting secretary is to immediately approve getting that service utilized here, and a process to make sure that we can tell as many people as possible their appointments are ready and available, and that we can get people seen. And the last thing is, I want accountability, and I specifically asked them to do further personnel investigations here, because I don't believe that that people didn't know that what they were doing was causing real harm and made those decisions anyway. And if that is tantamount to a criminal act, I want those persons prosecuted, and if it's not, at the very least, they don't belong in the VA system.
In the meantime, if we do see a director appointed here to lead Albuquerque's VA hospital soon, hopefully, what changes could we see immediately here?
Well, you would have on front line looking at those administrative issues. You would have someone who could help us immediately, locally, channel folks to the right private resources, and who also has the authority to approve those resources in a timely manner.
So they could get their treatments elsewhere outside of the system if necessary.
And one more thing I really want viewers to know, I also continue to push for, I want a private monitor in that hospital, even with an administrator appointed, and I think it's still warranted that the Department of Justice is investigating from a patient's rights the issues that we've all uncovered in terms of people who have potentially been harmed or died by lack of access to care when they were supposed to get care.
Absolutely. Keeping it moving along here because we don't have too much time. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Supreme Court's recent birth control decision. Of course, as people will remember, they voted that they decided in a 5-4 decision that Hobby Lobby, who brought the suit, and companies like that had a religious exemption essentially if they didn't want to provide certain forms of birth control to their employees, and that they had the right to do that. Now, this sort of became sort of a women's health care issue with the perception out there that this was going to make it more difficult for some women working for some companies to get birth control. I know a Republican lawmaker has recently said that this hasn't changed a woman's ability to access birth control, that they still have every right to purchase that birth control. Their employer simply doesn't have to cover it for them. From your perspective, what does this mean for a woman's ability to access health care?
I think it's completely unfair. I was very disappointed. And technically, that Republican lawmaker, absolutely, you know, women can find yet another place and privately pay. So that's more time off work. That means that, let's say that the only birth control or family planning device that works for you is an IUD. That's a month's pay for many of these women. Yeah, those are expensive. Interestingly enough, all of the male reproductive services are held. They're still going to be covered by insurance. So it looks to me like it's on its face discrimination, that there are real expenses here that people aren't talking about that are completely unfair, that these religious exemptions were intended, in my legal opinion, for individuals, and it really reshaped that companies can just decide, we don't like this kind of service, and so we're not going to allow you to access it, and we're not going to pay for it, which also minimizes employment choices for women, and that's hugely problematic. And last, and the thing that people are not paying attention to is that we've also diminished access. Actually, it's not the last thing. Like in Planned Parenthood, you know, where we stopped funding a lot of that access, so you really don't have it.
The free one,
or even reduced cost. But the last part that people don't seem, I think, to get a good grasp, and I was one of those young patients. There are many women who are on birth control because it's a life-saving life-saving measure and cannot have another pregnancy and have other issues occurring. So now we're saying that that treatment for that woman is not available. I think that's outrageous. And so I think it's got a chilling effect, and I worry that it's been easy to politicize in a more simple manner. Well, there's birth control pills, they're $1, they're not available. A company should get to decide if they just don't believe in that birth control and want a religious exemption. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's just. And interestingly enough, look at the gender split you had on the court.
Well, yes, absolutely. That's been pointed out. And, you know, this past week, a Democrat-backed bill that would have sort of fought back a little bit against that.
Basically would have reversed it by also providing access in different ways, was defeated in the Senate.
It was defeated. So will we continue to see another fight over this, another bill introduced?
House Democrats, including myself, are pushing a measure. We'll keep pushing to get that out, and I'm hoping that the Senate will return to that and work to find another way to get that bill out.
And how do you get around a Supreme Court decision like that, then? What, more or less, what would your bill seek to do?
What it does is it clarifies that it's now specifically required, and you do it in a different way. So that's what you do. You also provide access in more meaningful ways through Planned Parenthood and related services.
All right.
You can't just reverse the decision.
Yeah.
You have to find another legal mechanism that they can't defeat on religious exemptions.
And then that one might be fought at some point by a company.
And you made the most important point, Nicole. When is it going to be enough? These are battles that have been litigated. If you personally don't want that treatment or don't want to access birth control, whether you're a man or a woman, you don't have to in this country. I think that's fair. If we're trying to create balanced, comprehensive access to health care and insurance, we have to stop picking and choosing which gender and which services, and we have to be real that family planning is a health care issue for women.
Well said. The roads bill that Congress is working on right now, you guys approved somewhat of a stopgap measure to continue to fund.
Well, we've basically said the transportation highway trust fund. We've made sure that it's reauthorized. What we haven't done, so that's good. We reauthorized. What we haven't done is identified a funding solution for the highway trust fund. I'm disappointed that Congress isn't doing that. You know, we have the ability to start doing that, and it means that we have to be willing to make some investments and expecting a return. Here's one where I think if we invest in the Highway Trust Fund, we get an immediate return on our investment, and I hope the next several months give us the opportunity to get that right.
Absolutely. Now you have till May, till that one comes up again. A lot of people, I think, are concerned about constantly hearing stopgap measures. So not just with this roads issue, but with anything. Do you believe that Congress can solve things permanently rather than continuously coming back? You know, with the shutdown last year, we certainly saw various stopgap measures leading up to that.
You have to believe that's our job, and you have to believe that. And I'm optimistic. You know, when my first year in Congress was an F year in Congress for Congress. I hope my constituents believe that I don't have an F year. We get a lot done, and actually, as a brand new freshman, I've actually passed a couple of bills and an amendment, and in this, that's no easy trick. The women, bipartisan, bicameral, have brokered every major deal, and we are at least now going through the motions. We're reauthorizing laws, we're having discussions. The next step is now we have to have the courage to make sound investments where they're needed, and not to be so risk averse as we're closing the deficit that we're unwilling, and that the Tea Party has determined that they don't want any investment in our American economy. We cannot stand for that any longer.
With our last little minute left, I do want to give you an opportunity to plug a foreclosure workshop, prevention workshop that you will be holding on July 26th here for New Mexicans here in Albuquerque.
You did it. I want people to come. It's from 9 to 3 o'clock. It's at West Mesa High School. It's in an area where we have the highest foreclosures. New Mexico's got 8,000 foreclosures. 7,000 people in default. I'm bringing the banks. Let's see if we can't get them to protect your mortgage, and by giving you a payment you can make.
So a chance to hear directly from the banks and how they can be a part of the solution.
Yes, to work directly with them to resolve your mortgage issue on site. I really need people to come, and I'm very excited that we have all the major banks participating.
Excellent. We'll be sure to have that on the news, of course, this coming week, reminding everyone Saturday, July 26th. Thank you, Congresswoman Grisham, for being here.
I appreciate
this morning, and good luck with the last few weeks in Congress here before the break, and we'll see you again, and we'll see you back here next weekend for another Eye on New Mexico.